Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. So the question today, are we broken or just divided? And how are the political players answering that question? If the polls are right, then the conservative response seems to be resonating. But is that really an embrace of conservatism or just a rejection of this liberal government? So today, what is a conservative? And we are going to Speer. He's come on this podcast before. We love it when he does. I'm going to read this. You've got more titles than anybody I can think of here. Political analyst and Munk Senior Fellow for Fiscal Policy at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, project co-director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy's Ontario's 360 Research Project, and a fellow in residence at the Public Policy Forum. He was a senior economic advisor to Prime Minister Harper. I'm just going to call him henceforth a public policy nerd. How about that?
Yeah, I always feel self-conscious when people read my various affiliations. The truth of the matter, it's just because none of them pay very well.
So you have to have 20 in order to earn a living.
Precisely.
I want to start on a serious note because you've actually been writing a lot in the last year or so. You're very prolific, but you wrote a piece the other day which just really touched me because the whole world, of course, is looking at Israel and the barbarity, I don't know what other word to use, of Hamas. And people are sort of saying, well, you know, the discussing this, that when the crisis or the violence is so far away, we tend to turn it off, you know, just shut off the TV and go back to something else. But you're saying for you, Parenthood has changed that. It was a really interesting point.
Yeah. I'm sure, like you woke up a couple of Saturdays ago thinking it was going to be a normal weekend. I was watching Coco Melon or Paw Patrol. I can't remember which, with my 2.5-year-old, and my 9-month-old would be up soon. And of course, I opened my phone and discovered that Israel was under siege by Hamas, a terrorist organization. And what we've learned in the subsequent days is that these weren't your ordinary border skirmishes between Israel and Hamas.
That we're so used to, right?
Precisely. This was something fundamentally different. And, you know, the stories that we've learned about the barbarity, especially concerning children in parts of southern Israel I think can't help but affect you. And as a parent in particular, Senator Wallin, I picture my boys either you know, being subject to this just brutal violence, or in some ways worse, being taken hostage in Gaza. I'm sure you saw the clip of the man who said he felt relief when he discovered his 7-year-old or 8-year-old had been murdered in the kibbutz and not taken hostage. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'll just say this. I actually think living in the world of public policy and politics, you learn there's actually a lot of gray. You're in the Senate. There's a lot more gray, I think, than most people realize. And I think the extent to which I have strengths as a public policy analyst, it's that I'm pretty empathetic. Even where I disagree with the other side, I can understand where they're coming from. Oftentimes, we're dealing with what you might describe as kind of competing priorities, you know, economic efficiency versus equity, freedom versus order, equality versus liberty. This is about twisting a dial to, you know, sort of calibrate for the moment. I must admit, in the past 10 days or so, I've had a very difficult time empathizing with those whose first instinct in the face of what we've seen is either to celebrate the attacks, which is, you know, frankly un-Canadian.
We're seeing on our own soil, which is mind-blowing.
Precisely. Or to try to rationalize it as if these are the reasonable responses to, you know, typical disagreements between nation states. And I think that the extent to which I am a parent has probably only reinforced just the way in which I've recoiled in the face of what we've seen, and am pretty, at least at this point, steadfast behind Israel and its need to respond with, with real strength. In part because the geopolitical analysts who you might have on in subsequent shows will talk about deterrence and all of the rest. But I think it's just like at a more fundamental level, they have to respond to a terrorist organization that has crossed their border and brutalized women and children.
Yeah, this is not warring sides and soldiers killing one another. When you are actually talking about the taking a baby hostage, or worse yet, beheading a baby or torturing a baby, it's beyond what we're able to comprehend, I think.
Yeah, we don't have a kind of lexicon even to talk about it in a conventional political conversation. One can agree or disagree with Israeli policy. One can support or oppose the Israeli government. But this strikes me as just something fundamentally different. And I do think it generally speaks well of the Canadian political class, Senator Wallin, that we've ultimately got to the right place, I think. It took a little while, and it's still bumpy, of course. We're speaking on October 18th, and I note the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Melanie Joly, still has a tweet posted on her account, which suggests that it's her view, and ostensibly the view of the government of Canada, that Israel was behind this bombing or rocket attack of a Gazan hospital. But setting those aside, I think the Prime Minister, the official opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, and various others, I think, have responded, at least thus far, with the right amount of moral outrage and uncompromised support for Israel.
Yeah. Well, it was a really interesting point, because we do tend to just, shut it down and say, no sense looking at those pictures anymore. But I think you're quite right as a young parent. And I think a lot of people are feeling that this is just somehow significantly inexplicable, but much more powerful as well. So thank you for raising that. I want to come back. I was telling you before we started recording here that I've been carrying around this file on which I have a little sticker that says "Wither Tories." So this dates back, I don't know, months and months, about, because there's been a lot of leadership changes, and then Pierre Poilievre is elected and endorsed as leader, and he's kind of coming into his own. There was a video this week making the rounds on Twitter and X about him taking on a reporter who was asking a rather ill-formed question about what is
what do you think about that, Senator Wallin, as a former journalist? What was your reaction?
Well, it was an absurd comment from I'm going to say so-called journalist. I'm just going to say that because I don't know who the person is, but that is not in any way journalism. That was his personal opinion, and he wanted Pierre Poilievre to respond to it. It's just not journalism. So whatever it is, Poilievre just chomped on his apple and answered him. It was kind of an interesting exchange, but it does sort of raise the question of what is conservatism today. You were writing one piece where I know you said, I'm not a hyphenated anything, I'm a conservative. So let's start there with, what does that mean to you?
Oh boy, I have a few books behind me by William F. Buckley Jr., who is one of the most prominent popular conservative intellectuals in the 20th century. And he started, as I understand it, to write a book on the definition of conservatism, and he stopped because it was so hard. I would say that, generally speaking, conservatism, as I understand it, Senator Wallin, is not a universal ideology in the same way that liberalism or socialism is, by which I mean it is inherently contingent and particularistic. So a Saudi Arabian conservative is different than a Canadian conservative or an American conservative or a French conservative. It starts with the premise that ideas and institutions that have evolved over time have persisted for a reason. They match the needs of the society broadly. And so, what are those institutions, ideas, and values here in Canada? I would
Yep.
say that they are essentially a form of classical liberalism. It is protection of minority rights. It is the rule of law. It is a democratic representation within a parliamentary system. It is our constitutional monarchy. It is a kind of free market economy. It is our system of federalism, which has over time evolved into being one of the most decentralized
Yep.
in the advanced
Yep.
world. So that's, I think, what it is in a nutshell. How that manifests itself then is efforts on the part of others to undermine or erode or diminish those institutions or ideas and values. It seems to me there's an onus on conservatives to, one, call those out, and second, to advance ideas and priorities that will protect and strengthen those ideas and institutions. So just to be concrete about it, because I know that can feel a bit in the clouds, let me take up the example of a decentralized system of federalism. I feel very strongly about that. I think it is one of the ways in which a country like Canada has thrived. We've created a way for economic difference, political difference, cultural difference to coexist in a national political arrangement by pushing down a lot of important choices to, what one might call a form of subsidiarity. And the Trudeau government has consistently sought, through the use of the federal spending power, to, in effect, undermine that system of decentralized federalism and essentially reverse it, to try to push more in a centralized model whereby Ottawa decides not just decisions about natural resources, which of course the Supreme Court recently weighed in, but even more granular ones, like what childcare workers ought to earn in the city of Toronto or Regina or Thunder Bay or whatever. And so, in the particular case, I think there's an onus on conservatives to challenge those ideas and put forward alternatives
and to resist it. I mean, I think you were writing about that and saying that the provinces have kind of, in exchange for the money, because the feds always have the money to say, we'll give you this for healthcare or childcare. Yes. But in return for that money, then you have to do X, Y, and Z. Yes. And that's where they end up even forfeiting some of their jurisdiction and their power.
Precisely. And I worked in Ottawa. I know that those federal dollars, even if they come with strings attached, can be pretty attractive in the immediate term. But as you say, what it does is it chips away at provincial jurisdiction, and it undermines the ability of provinces in the future to challenge instances of federal overreach because they've effectively been complicit in others. So that's a very long way of saying, at its core, I think that Canada is, for all intents and purposes, part of basically a kind of North American set of ideas and institutions. They are what one might describe as classical liberal ones, which can be a bit counterintuitive at times. Conservatives, in a way, at least in North America, are trying to conserve liberalism, which we can talk a bit about if you want. But that's the way I've come to think about it. And within that, of course, there'll be a lot of policy debates and debates about priorities, and we've seen that play out in big C conservative politics. But as a Canadian conservative, I think fundamentally what we're trying to do is conserve the ideas, institutions, and the spirit of the Confederation Project of 1867.
Because even when you come down to the little issues, it's like you have the Conservatives responding to the change in passports, taking off the pictures of Vimy or heroes from the past and replacing it with people frolicking in the snow or whatever it may be. And that does, it seems like a small thing, but to your point, it's a large thing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it reflects a kind of difference in the mindset of progressives and conservatives. A conservative says, if something has managed to persist over time, we probably should be a bit humble about simply discarding it, assuming that we know better than those who've come before us. Whereas I think a progressive assumes that we are on this inevitable track of progress. And, essentially everything old is worse than what we have now or what we aspire to have. And the truth is, Senator Wallin, I think both impulses are probably healthy. Conservatism in and of itself can come to defend institutions or ideas that by virtue of just the fact that they've existed for a long time.
Yeah. And that's not.
Yeah. I mean,
the right
I mentioned Bill Buckley, National Review magazine, which in a lot of ways is was the home, the intellectual home for a lot of conservative debate in the second half of the American and in the 20th century in the United States, opposed the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. And I think that it did that in part because it fell victim to this conservative instinct to want to preserve what they know and what has persisted for a long time. So I don't think progressivism in and of itself is inherently wrong. It becomes wrong when it is utopian and when it becomes a kind of arrogant, frankly, about the presumption that we know more than everyone that's come before us, that somehow we're more enlightened, that we're more compassionate, etc. And the truth is the two instincts or impulses, go well with each other in a democratic society.
Well, and I think we saw that when the Prime Minister opined that we were the first post-national state and that we didn't have an identity, and everybody went, "What are you talking about?" Yes. And worse yet, that became frightening. It was kind of the ultimate of what you're saying there, the arrogance of the new, right?
Yeah, we see that playing out even now with, the idea that we should be taking down statues of Sir John Macdonald because for some reason he doesn't conform to social norms and expectations in 2023. That reflects a kind of arrogance of the present. And I assure progressive listeners who have those instincts today that come 21, 23, whoever's looking back at us is going to have a lot of the same views. I don't know precisely what parts of modern society will be the subject of derision. And maybe it's eating meat or something like that, because in the intervening century they've conceived of alternatives. But I think there's an American scholar, Senator Wallin, I like a great deal, named Yuval Levin, and he says, in a word, conservatism is gratitude. It's gratitude for what we've inherited, and and therefore a kind of starting point that we have a responsibility to future generations not to succumb to arrogance and sort of mess it up. It doesn't mean that we ought to be opposed to any and all forms of change, but we should start with a presumption of gratitude. And I think that's a useful way to kind of think about conservatism in the abstract.
That's in my gut, in the sense that I, age and stage. I mean, I came of age at a time when anything was possible, the post-war boom, in the 50s and 60s. And I had choices, the burden of choice in some cases, but, we were given so much, and we're still given so much, that's a really interesting way to put it, that there should be gratitude. This was somewhere I was reading, and I kind of liked it, a definition. To be conservative is to prefer the familiar to the unknown, to prefer the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the sufficient to the superabundant, the convenient to the perfect, present laughter to utopian bliss. It really kind of covers the water.
That's Michael Oakeshott, who, in many ways is the father, along with figures like Edmund Burke and others, a real father of modern, and I would say Anglo-American conservatism. But I think that in a way beautifully captures an impulse. It's so funny, Senator Wallin, I'm a conservative in my politics. That is to say, I have basic assumptions about political economy and foreign policy and all the rest. But I find that that the Oakeshott quote you reference reflects even just my own personal habits and temperament. Like, this is a very small example, but I think it'll resonate with conservative listeners. I get the same sandwich from Subway every time I have Subway. I don't have Subway a lot, but it's just I like the same. I have a lot of the same shirts.
Yeah.
There's just something about the familiar that appeals to me, and I think that is a generally healthy instinct. I'll just make one other point though, because I do think it is important. You mentioned before we got on the American writer David Brooks, and David Brooks has this interesting formulation, which gets back to my point about conservatism being contextual. David Brooks says, on one hand, he's a Burkean, and he has sort of Edmund Burke on his shoulder, and that brings with it some of the impulses we've been talking to, a resistance to change, a preference for incrementalism, and so on. But he's from North America, and North America is individualistic. It's dynamic. It is, as you say, a place where people can have aspirations about social mobility. It's a striver society, and so he also has Alexander Hamilton on his shoulder. Right. And I think that's what makes North American conservatism unique and special. And I would say Canada is part of that story too. We have some of those conservative instincts, but we're also fundamentally a frontier society. You represent Saskatchewan, of course. And so I do think that in a way is what distinguishes Canadian conservatism from, say, continental European conservatism, which remains a conservatism of throne and altar, blood and soil in a way. We've managed to kind of create a version of conservatism here that reconciles a predisposition to the past, but also optimistic eye to the future. That's at least been the modern history of Canadian conservatism and North American conservatism. I would say that in the past several years, for various reasons, that optimism of the future, towards the future, has been something that's been missing in some conservative circles. And I think actually one of the reasons Pierre Poilievre has been so successful is that he manages to effectively incorporate both conservative impulses into the way he thinks and talks about public policy in the country.
This was the headline and a story in the line. McDonald's isn't a burger company, it's a real estate business. What business is the modern CPC in? Conservative Party. Anger or governing? And actually, it's kind of both.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would say you mentioned the sense of promise that was available to you. That's my experience too. I grew up in a pretty resolutely middle-class home. I had loving parents, which I recognize as a huge advantage. But I didn't really have much of a sense of the ceiling. I suppose at some level I understood I probably wouldn't have like Ken Thompson's money, and I probably won't own a yacht or something like that. But I genuinely believe that based on my personal effort, maybe some lucky breaks, that I could kind of do essentially what I aspired to do.
And hard work. Work.
Yeah, and I think that in a way is at the center of Pierre Poilievre's political proposition. Just think about it. He is one stop away from becoming the prime minister of the country, someone who was the adopted son of a teenage mother to two teachers. It reflects, frankly, the best of Canada. There are very few other societies around the world where someone like that could reasonably aspire to lead the country. In the United States, it would be extremely hard because, of course, their politics are so driven by financial resources, and that relies on networks and being part of the right circles and so on. And so, in his convention speech, Pierre talked a lot about the promise of Canada, and it resonated with me such a great deal because it's what I believe in my bones. It's my own, I hate to use this word, but my lived experience. And I think there is a growing sense that promise of Canada is no longer as bright as it was when you were a striver, or when I was a striver. And I think in a way, Pierre's message is that the conditions that created that promise are not accidents. They require attention, they require care, and that his political purpose in a way is to restore and strengthen that promise of Canada. I think that's a very powerful political proposition, and the fact that it happens to be his own personal story makes it even more powerful.
So you can be angry, to go back to the phrase there, that it's broken, but optimistic that it's possible to fix. And there is an echo of, Donald Trump there, although I really resist the comparisons between the two because I think we're two different things. But that was what his message was in part, which is make America great again. Now it's become something totally different, but it was great, and then it got broken, and now we can fix it. And I don't know, that's what I hear from Poilievre.
Yeah, I'm just thinking through what you said. That's an interesting point. So in a way, let's just talk through that. So there's the Make America Great Again, which wasn't just a slogan. It was a way of thinking about the challenges facing the country and what his political purpose was. And Pierre has talked about the promise of Canada. I think the main difference is the latter is inclusive. That is to say, anyone who's prepared to work hard and has good character and, as I say, probably benefits from some lucky breaks, he or she can, have the kind of life that they aspire to. My sense is Make America Great Again has a particular set of assumptions about who and what the end goals ought to be. It is really focused, I think, disproportionately on restoring the kind of status of white males in the society,
and individual success.
And particularly white males in traditional sectors. Like, you just get the sense that Donald Trump thinks that America was at its best at some point in like the 1950s when men without university or college education could earn decent salaries in like the automotive sector or the steel sector or something like that. Whereas I think the promise of Canada as a way to think about the opportunities and challenges facing the country is a bit more dynamic. That is, it's not stuck in a particular frame for what the end goal ought to be, and it's more inclusive. Pierre has this great line. I'm doesn't matter if your name is Smith or Singh, and he kind of goes on with it. And I don't want to sound naive or sentimental, but it kind of gives me goosebumps because that is the kind of country that I.
Yeah. And I really want to preface my remarks by saying I am not making the comparisons between the two. It's just that in politics, as you well know, you look for those simple messages that resonate, which is we can get back to where we once were, which is cherishing the past, but it also embraces an ability to change and have new stuff and better stuff, right?
There's, to come back to my point about the uniqueness of a North American conservatism, just about my favorite line, in a way it sort of reflects the way I think of my own conservatism, is a Reagan line, of course. And Reagan said, I don't want to go back to the past. I want to go back to the past way of thinking about the future. And I think in a lot of ways that just beautifully captures this unique balance embedded in conservatism that has reverence for the past, but is not nostalgic. It is still ultimately future oriented. And I think that striking that balance is when conservatism at its best. When it succumbs to a kind of nostalgia, it's when it feels kind of increasingly, I think, distant from the kind of interests and needs and aspirations of people as they are today.
Right. And not just white guys in the 50s. Yeah. No, I think that's a really important distinction. I want to just carry on in the conversation, though, about the messaging, because the anger or the concern, it doesn't necessarily have to be anger, is real. Like, we are a country that is defined by really sharp regional distinctions and differences. If you grow up in Saskatchewan, you have a very different worldview than if you live in downtown Toronto. And even the divide in the Conservative Party about the Tory wing, the Eastern Upper Canada, view of the world, and then the anti-Laurentian view, we're the Western-based view of this. We look at Eastern Canada's obsession with Quebec. I mean, that's one of the reasons that Preston Manning worked as well as he did, which is the West wants in. It was that, that kind of more positive spin on it. We want to be part of this.
Yes.
We've been out here breaking the land and, doing all those things. providing the money through energy, but you've got to recognize that as a real part of this country.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it was Brian Mulroney who said the first responsibility of the prime minister is to manage national unity. And I think if you judge the Trudeau government on that through that lens, it's hard not to argue that in the 7 or so years that the prime minister has been in power, that national unity has diminished, and that regional flashpoints have grown. And so, yeah, I think one of the things that Pierre needs to be cognizant of is managing those differences. And I think he generally has. One of the strengths of Pierre, and I won't criticize anyone else per se, but maybe implicit in my observation as a criticism, is I think Pierre has stuck to a macro national message and political agenda. He has not sought, Senator Wallin, to have differentiated messages and priorities in different parts of the country. And I think that serves you well. You're trying to create connective tissue across regions. You're not trying to kind of build like a chessboard, a political coalition, one region at a time based on.
Well, and look, you can't do it with modern media. You can't. In the old days when you were whistle
on a train,
on trains, you could do that. But today you can't have 15 different messages depending on where you are. Yeah,
exactly. But there was again, I'm not criticizing anyone, but there was a sense coming out of the 2019 election that there was a kind of inherent inefficiency to the Conservative national voting coalition. And if only some way you could lower the level of support in parts of Western Canada and have that offset by increases in other parts of the exactly. and that if you perfectly calibrated your position on different issues, you could manage to kind of pull that off. And I think I think not only is it inefficient as a political strategy, it's also a dangerous game, right? And so in that sense, I think Pierre has been well served by a single message that I think is that he believes deep in his bones about freedom, personal responsibility, limited government, and so on. And that's a message that he's delivered consistently and uncompromisingly, whether he's in Moose Jaw or Sherbrooke. And I think that I think that's the right way to try to address. And then just the last thing, I guess, is, and then genuinely committed, he must be genuinely committed to that decentralized system of federalism that we were talking about earlier. It's so crazy to me, Senator Wallin, the Supreme Court has just, come down against the Bill C-69.
Yeah.
And I've seen no evidence that the Trudeau government is chastened in any way, or is even
quite the contrary.
I mean, they've
just going to tweak a few things.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that this isn't interpreted as like a serious need for rebalancing in the relative role of Ottawa versus the provinces. This is a minor setback. We're going to ram through amendments to constitutionalize the law and essentially be back to where we were before last week. I think that is highly dangerous for unity and cohesion, and why I think Pierre Poilievre would be well served by talking about the benefits of our system of federalism, which as I said earlier, have evolved. This is not the federalism that Sir John A. Macdonald wanted, incidentally. Yeah. Right?
That is true. Yeah.
But as Conservatives, we don't remain kind of locked in precisely what he or others thought in 1867. We're responsive to the way that the system has evolved over time. And it's evolved that way for a reason. It's evolved because we've figured out that this is the best way to manage economic, political, and cultural differences across a vast country like Canada. That's worth something. That's worth protecting and preserving.
Yeah, and I think that court decision, I mean, it's very low key. There's not reportage on it because, of course, we are dealing with the Middle East and other things. I'm not sure there would be anyway, because it's not something that the central Canadian focus of the media really embraces. But this is a huge thing. And I think it has repercussions on other issues because we've seen government encroach, even if you look at Bill C11 and C18, moving forward with more control. I would call it censorship. Others are more modest on their critique. But, that makes that challengeable in my mind, because when you start interfering with, it's not just because it's up there in the air and everything is fair game. If it's up there in the air, it's not.
Yes. So, yeah. And I'd even say, with respect to the division of powers, like, if you think about it, Senator Wallin, what are the Trudeau government's biggest accomplishments? Even if you put yourself in their shoes, they're almost all policy areas in provincial jurisdiction, right? Healthcare, dental care, childcare, social housing, etc. I mean, this is a government. It's the weirdest thing. Like, all of these people sought to get elected to national parliament, who are by and large disinterested in the powers granted to our national government. Like, what, I've said at different times, we're living in a Section 91 moment, by which I mean the world is increasingly dangerous and complicated, and those are the powers granted to the national government: security, defense, etc.
Yeah.
And yet we have a bunch of politicians in Ottawa, particularly members of the government, who are interested in Section 92. They all want to be premiers or provincial health ministers.
That's a really excellent way to put it, because I think that's what's happening, is everybody's looking at the Section 91 issues in this very dangerous, complicated world and saying, why didn't we know about Chinese interference? Or why did we say that about India? And blah, all of those kinds of things, and cuts to the defense budget, and not really being proactive on all of that. And as you say, jumping into the provincial field.
I think that one of, I serve for Mr. Harper, and so listeners can, interpret what I'm about to say through that lens. I have a bias, but I think one of his greatest strengths as prime minister was that he resisted the temptation, by and large. He wasn't perfect, but he resisted the temptation, by and large, to use the federal spending power to intrude himself in provincial and local issues. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he governed over during a period of time in which national unity was probably at its strongest. And the federal spending power has been part, by which I'm referring to the tendency on the part of the federal government to use the power of the purse to essentially drive its way into provincial and local areas with the kind of strings that we were talking about earlier. There is academic scholarship that shows that evaluates the trend historically, and it ebbed during the Harper years, and it's reached historic, unprecedented new levels under the current government. And as I say, I don't think it's an accident that it correlates with not just a spike in national unity challenges, but essentially the wiping out of the Liberal Party at the provincial level across the country. Mm-hmm. And so I do think, of the various ways in which a Poilievre-led government would, in my judgment, produce better outcomes for Canada, a more restrained view about Ottawa's role and a greater attention to the stuff for which it's actually responsible, I think would be a positive development for the country.
Okay, just before we leave this topic, because I want to ask you about Barstool Conservatism and center-ice conservatism, but you also wrote recently about the big sort, which has to do with, we see it in the media world where everybody lives in their own echo chambers, but the big sort, and there's academics on both sides of the border talking about this, which is now we tend to live actually in those echo chambers as opposed to just spending time there. And you referenced this about, if you could move the Western Canadian vote to downtown Toronto and somehow divide it up, it would all work out. But actually, once we are sorted into economic and philosophical and geographic areas, that becomes really difficult.
It does. I'm glad you asked about this, because I think this is such a cool topic. Me too. And hopefully it leaves listeners kind of thinking, because I think the potential scenarios here are fascinating. So to step back for a second, there's pretty good scholarship. In fact, probably the best book, if listeners are interested, Senator Wallin, is by an economist in the U.S. named Enrico Moretti. It's called The Geography of Jobs. It was written in the first decade of the 2000s. And what it documented, as others have, is the transition from a goods-producing economy to a knowledge economy has led to the growing concentration of investment and job creation and so on in large urban centers. This isn't unique to Canada, although I would argue, in fact, that Canada is more hyper-concentrated in a relatively small number of cities than even the United States. Right. The trend, to use a really awful academic word or phrase, is urban agglomeration. And so if you were someone from Thunder Bay with post-secondary credentials and a set of skills or aptitudes that would position you well to work in the knowledge economy, you basically had no choice. You had to go to Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver. And that has led to this process of self-sorting. And so we have a hyper-concentration of urban professionals with a high degree of human capital and, generally speaking, more progressive political preferences in our major cities. And then in peripheral and smaller communities, we have a higher rate, higher levels of those without post-secondary credentials, tend to be working more in the goods-producing economy, think natural resources or whatever, and generally speaking, more conservative predispositions. And that frame isn't perfect, but if you actually look at Canada's electoral map, it broadly describes our politics over the past 20 years or so. What I think is super fascinating is due in part to high housing prices in our major cities. People are what the economist Mike Moffat has described as driving until they qualify. And as well, of course, the rise, what appears to be the durability of remote or hybrid work, is also permitting people to choose to live outside of those major centers in the name of either a more affordable housing or larger housing or a backyard or whatever.
Yeah. Life-work balance. Yeah.
Of course. And I think one of the most fascinating thought experiments is if this change is durable and it happens in meaningful numbers, and I think there is evidence that it is, that migration levels out of, say, the city of Toronto are quite high, and it's disproportionately young families who are represented in those numbers. Does it start to change on the margins the politics of the more conservative places that they're moving to? Or do those more conservative places sort of change the politics of those people? And I think it's obviously too early to say, but it could, in theory, lead to conservative ridings, say a couple hundred kilometers outside of the city of Toronto, possibly start to become purplish as progressive professionals move to those cities and become active and present in their politics. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a kind of dynamic when it comes to the interaction between work, place, and politics that I've been thinking about. And I guess in some, what it amounts to, in a way, is the undoing at some level of the big sort that we were talking about a few minutes earlier.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting experiment. I mean, I'm sure the pollsters will get to that, but as you're saying, it's too early to do that. But it will change, and if everything becomes purple, what does that mean, right?
Yeah,
it's emerging.
Yeah, I'm afraid. I mean, there could be an argument, I suppose, that it could actually produce more responsive politics in a kind of counterintuitive way. One thing that people don't realize is we have a lot of ridings in this country with margins that are north of, say, 20 percentage points pretty consistently. Particularly in Alberta, where conservatives win with large margins. But it's not limited to the conservatives. The Liberals, there are a number of ridings in parts of Eastern Canada and Quebec where Liberals have, over the past 20 years, won, with, as I say, an average of 20 percentage points or more. If some of those places started to become more competitive, one can't help but think it would put pressure on those local representatives to, frankly, do a better job. to
Really
not
good
take
point.
those communities for granted. So that's maybe a positive spin on the possibility of this sorting sort of spreading itself out,
Yeah.
more distributed across the country.
Okay. We've gone on here forever and we could go on for 2 hours, but you wrote about the rise of Barstool Conservatism, and you're going to have to explain that to people. Kind of for a younger demographic than moi, I'm going to say.
Even slightly younger than me. But you mentioned regional fissures in the country, and the potential for those to, really come to dominate our politics. I think an underexplored or underappreciated fissure is a generational one, and we're seeing that play out. In the sense that one of the extraordinary things about Pierre Poilievre's leadership thus far, Senator Wallin, is he has moved the Conservative Party in a way that it makes it unique in the Anglo-American world, which is to say he's outperforming with young voters and underperforming with old voters. That is the inverse of essentially every Conservative Party elsewhere in the Western world. And I think
the history here as well. Yeah,
precisely. And I think the reason he's doing it in part is because he has so effectively communicated the problem and a set of solutions around housing, and just a general sense, Senator Wallin, that the life stages that, as we've understood them over, we've been socialized to understand them, are under threat. The idea that you go to university, you get a degree, that produces a kind of return on your investment in terms of your employment opportunities, your income. That link between credentials and employment and income is being, if not broken, then certainly eroded. The idea that you would be able to afford a home is, of course, now outside of the realm of possibility for a lot of people. And I think one of the secondary consequences of those trends is it's leading to delayed marriage. It's leading to delayed family formation. There's a think tank in Ottawa and Hamilton called Cardis that has done some work on the number of children that Canadian women want to have and the number of children that they actually have. And there's a gap. And one of the reasons, of course, is it's just people feel like it's taking longer to get established. And that is causing them to have to recalibrate their priorities and preferences with respect to their families. So that's a long way of saying there's something kind of interesting going on with young people. And Pierre Poilievre is tapping into it. I've just explained it primarily as a kind of economic or socioeconomic dynamic. The only other one I would add to that before I get to Barstool, because it is relevant, is what you might describe as a recoil to, for lack of a better term, wokeism. That I think Gen Zers in particular are the ones who've gone through education the most exposed to the excesses of identity politics. One, a kind of worldview that says, I don't need to know anything about you. All I need to know is what your gender is, or what your skin color is, or what your sexual preference is. And it is anti-enlightenment. It is going backwards. Absolutely. Right? And so I think Pierre is tapping into that a bit. And I think young people kind of counterintuitively are the most responsive to a critique of those trends, because they're the ones who are like scared to speak in class, are scared to have sexual relationships with women or men, whatever the matter be, because the whole environment just seems so fraught. And so there's something kind of interesting going on. And I think one window or proxy into those trends is something called Barstool. Listeners could be forgiven for not knowing what Barstool is, or being stoolies themselves. But it's basically a kind of sports culture and gambling website that started 20 years ago. It is not a place I would send my daughter. It is a bit raunchy. It is certainly anti-politically correct. But it's a place where kind of guys can be guys. It has a kind of it's not political, but to the extent to which one can discern like political impulses, it would be libertarian.
Yeah.
The right to smoke and drink and gamble, and I don't want the government telling me what I can do or not do. It, as I say, kind of rejects the excesses of political correctness, and it's a force. The company sold in the past several years for $500 million. The CEO of it, Dave Portnoy, actually interviewed Donald Trump in the Oval Office. I think if you want to understand particularly Gen Z males, I think going to Barstool is not a bad starting point. And
very interesting, eh?
There's I could go on and on because I think it's so fascinating. There was the whole GameStop movement during the pandemic. I think
just saw the movie about that. It's just amazing.
Yeah, and I think that is kind of similarly kind of caught up in the sense that particularly young men feel alienated from the culture. The New Democrats, Senator Wallin, had their convention last weekend. I don't know if you saw. If you were a white male, you had to
go to the back of the line.
Which is just, I know. It is crazy to think that we are going to, and they were using, did you see this? They were using white or yellow pieces of paper to identify whether people, what gender or ethnicity or whatever.
It's unbelievable.
And so in that context, I think young men are looking for outlets that affirm them as men, it's kind of a safe spot from that kind of craziness. And Barstool is part of that. And I think that leave us alone instinct is how I would describe Barstool conservatism. And I think Pierre has a bit of that in him. Like if you see who's attending his events, or you see him talking to particularly kind of blue collar men, I think they're drawn to him. These are people who've not necessarily participated in politics in the past. They aren't motivated because of his like elaborate tax policy or how he thinks about macroeconomics. They are drawn to him because he represents a challenge to some of those tendencies in our society. I'll stop rambling at you in a second.
Yeah, no, it's good though.
But one of the things that drives me crazy about political commentary in Canada is what do we often hear when it comes to gender-based politics in the country? It's that conservatives have a woman problem, right? Yeah. You hear that all the time. And presently polls suggest that the gap is closing, but but even setting aside, I accept the premise that there is something there I think conservatives do ask themselves some questions. What is it that stands in the way of women feeling like the Conservative Party can be something of a political home for them? I accept. I think that's a serious question. But how can we never talk about the Liberals' male problem? Yeah. Right? Like the Conservatives are beating the Liberals on male support by like 20-25 points. A much larger gap than the Liberals outperform the Conservatives when it comes to females. And yet it is completely absent from the political discourse. And I think it speaks again to this like growing feeling that men are, particularly young men, are a bit alienated and attenuated from the society. Again, to drop a book reference, Richard Reeves, who's a center-left scholar in the U.S., wrote a really powerful book on the subject last year that I would encourage people to check out. And his point is, it's wonderful. And it truly is. I'm married to a professional woman who's smarter, more accomplished, earns more than me. So I say this as someone who thinks that female progress in our society is something to be celebrated. But at the precise moment that women are really taking off in the professions and at universities and so on, we have a government applying a kind of gender-based lens to policy and neglecting actually that it is, in a lot of ways, young men, particularly those without post-secondary credentials, who are the kind of most at risk in today's economy. So that's a very long way of saying I think there is a lot of kind of power in this notion represented by Barstool that young men are a group in our society that we need to concern ourselves with a bit more, or or they risk kind of falling into some really dark and awful places. I said at the outset that Barstool isn't necessarily where, the perfect role model. There's a lot worse ones out there these days. And I think that is a reason for conservatives in particular, but I think Canadian policymakers in general to pay more attention to the kind of circumstances and conditions of young men in our country.
Oh, I mean, we all know this from personal experience with young men in your life, that work here or that are nephews or, that they're struggling. And that is, I was just reading this, a whole other topic, but I was reading something about this the other day about how the school system also works against them. Young boys need to be out. They need 3 or 4 recesses a day, not one, whereas girls are much more able and willing to sit and do homework and, follow the rules. And that we might have to respond to that, or we're creating a generation of kids that don't even get through the school system.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize the point, and it comes back in some ways to the discussion about Make America Great Again. The fact that we've transitioned from a goods producing economy, which preference males in a lot of ways, physicality, etc., to a knowledge based economy that preferences interpersonal skills, patience, self discipline, skills and traits that are not universally but disproportionately represented amongst women, is a good thing, and we shouldn't be trying to stop that or reverse that or something like that. As I say, my personal financial circumstances kind of count on that. But it is to say, just because we failed women in the past doesn't mean we should be failing men now, and somehow that represents a equilibrium. I think we need to kind of look at
the back of the line is not the point.
Look at the economy and the society as it presently is, and ask ourselves, how can we create the conditions for everyone to succeed? And I think it reflects, it's the craziest part of the left being drawn to this instinct to want to, create almost like a hierarchy of minority groups. I think it's highly corrosive, and I think it's to Pierre Poilievre's credit that he has kind of zeroed in on that. And if I had to bet, we could be 2 years out from election, I think his economic narrative is strong. He was amongst the first out warning about inflation and so on. He's really found his voice on the housing issue. Crime and kind of social dysfunction is something we're hearing more and more from him about. But if I had to guess, I think between now and the next election, we'll hear more about this stuff. That we've evolved to a point where your skin pigmentation, sexual orientation, and gender shouldn't be defining. And for some insane reason, progressives who assume themselves to be proponents of progress want to go backwards to a world in which that those things are essentially how we need to understand people and who they are and what's in their heart and so on, ought to be subordinated. I think that is crazy, and I think it's important actually that conservatives prosecute the case against those trends before they start to kind of permeate our society more broadly.
Just really, really interesting stuff. This is great. We could talk for 2 days, but we can't. I have to go to work. You have to go to work. One of your 20 jobs. But you can see why this man is ranked amongst the most influential thinkers in this country, because he really is. So, Sean, with all your jobs at the Munk Center, at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and reading all those books there behind you, just really a pleasure to have this conversation with you about what's actually going on inside the Conservative Party.
Well, it's always great to be with you. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sean Speer. So that's it for this edition of No Nonsense, and we'll invite him back soon, for sure. We'll see you soon. Thanks so much.